Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 362 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is best-selling thriller writer Jeffery Deaver. He's the author of more than 35 novels and 3 short story collections, and his books have been sold in 150 countries and translated into 25 languages. His 1997 novel The Bone Collector, the first volume in the Lincoln Rhymes series, was adapted into a feature film starring Denzel Washington and Angelina Jolie. And we'll be speaking with Jeff today about his latest novel, The Never Game, about a kidnapper who seems to be modeling his crimes on a popular video game. And now here's our interview with Jeffery Deaver. All right, so we're here with Jeffery Deaver. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Dave.
Okay, so your new book is called The Never Game. So what made you want to start up a new series with a new protagonist?
About 30 years ago, it pains me to say that. I'd actually written a few books at that point, but a long time ago, I had a series about a fellow who traveled around the country, sort of an itinerant amateur private eye, I guess you'd call him, and he was a location scout for a film company. And he would go to town looking for movies, and of course something untoward would happen. You know, like in a Tom Cruise movie or Bruce Willis movie, you never want to be the sidekick because in the first 20 minutes the sidekick gets offed. Well, that's what happened to my character John Pelham. And it started to get, I love the idea of regional mysteries of a fellow traveling around the country, sort of a la Shane, you know, the old Alan Ladd Jr. movie. But it got a little, I guess I would say contrived, because he'd come to town, get set with the movie, and then something bad would happen. So I went on to write books like The Bone Collector and several other series. But I had it in the back of my mind that I always wanted to revisit that. And I guess it was a couple of years ago, I was watching a true crime story, and it mentioned a reward that was offered for finding the murder of a young woman, I think in New England somewhere, one that hadn't, a cold case, nobody had been able to solve it. And I thought, there's my idea. There's my fellow. I created a character, Colter Shaw, who travels around the country in a Winnebago looking for rewards. And, we can chat a little bit more about him if you like, but I will say that he isn't really interested in the money. It turns out, not much of a surprise, but it turns out he doesn't really care about the money. What he likes about a reward is that it represents a problem that no one else has been able to solve. Because if there were no reward, if the case had been solved, it wouldn't be an issue. It would be sort of a straightforward kind of case. But if no one can find the missing person, if no one can find the escaped fugitive, and a reward is offered, that's a red flag to him that he, being a restless man, self-described restless man, jumps into the fray and tries to track down the criminal or find the missing person.
It's funny what you were saying about the location scout who always stumbles across a murder. Years ago I watched a panel at a conference, and there was a woman, and she wrote a series of murder mysteries set at a college. And so each year somebody got murdered. And she said by the time she got to book 4 or 5 or something, she was like, why is anyone going to this school still?
Exactly. I mean, of course, the ranks of the students had been decimated by that point. So they had tuition problems too, I would imagine.
But this idea of going around the country just to collect rewards, this isn't something that anyone has actually done. This is something that you dreamed up all by yourself.
Yeah, I wanted to be credible about it, and I try to write authentically. And I suggest in the book that there are other people who do this. Of course, we know bond enforcement agents who, if you skip bail or something, they track you down. We've seen some TV shows about that. But I had I did research, and a fair amount of research, just couldn't find anybody who did this for a profession. Of course, I write fiction, I make up stuff for a living, so that didn't stop me. I was kind of hoping for like a national association of reward seekers or an organization like that, but I there is no such thing. And to be honest, the reward really doesn't play a huge role. It's a inciting incident. That's a term in Hollywood. That's sort of like the set piece beginning that starts the characters on their journey. And sometimes he may get the reward, but sometimes he just gives it away, or to the despair of his business agent says, "Oh, you know what? You look like you're having a tough time here. Pay me give me 10% of it. Oh, you can't even do that. We'll work out easy terms. And he's got an accountant, kind of lawyer, business manager. It's always perplexing her when she hears he's done that.
Yeah. Well, so Coulter Shaw, he has this interesting backstory where he was raised on this compound with a survivalist dad.
Yeah, this is kind of interesting, Dave. I've always been a plot-driven writer, and if you like, we can certainly chat about the technique. But in a nutshell, I spent about 8 months outlining my books. That's all I do. Well, I do research at the same time, but it's the pre-planning. In the case of the Never Game, the outline ended up being about 150 pages. It has, as all of my books, for the last 30 or so, I wrote some kind of simpler murder mysteries a long, long time ago. But when I started to write the thrillers, the bigger books, they have at least three subplots going on at the same time. They have a lot of internal reversals, and they have surprise endings. Each book has at least 3 surprise endings, so that we think it's done, and yet there's still 30 pages left. What's going on here? And I turn the tables yet again. So by that, I simply mean that I'm a very story-driven author. I love the way plots fit together, and they're kind of choreographed. And I had always let the characters take a bit of a second place to that. And some authors write exclusively character-driven stories. I wrote a James Bond novel a few years ago, and if you've ever read any of those, I'm not talking about the movies now, but the original Ian Fleming books, we meet the good guy, that's James Bond, and we meet the bad guy, who might be Blofeld or some other Goldfinger, some other evil dude. And it's a very linear story. We know there's going to be a confrontation at the end, and yet why we read those books is about the characters. But I tended to not pay too much attention to the characters, and I'd like to give them a backstory and make them fairly fleshed out. But then I read something that I found quite interesting. This was a few years ago, that the same part of our brain, and I'm sure among your listeners there'd be a neuroscientist who could, or a medical person who could explain this, but the same part of our brain that recognizes our connections with real human beings, whether they're good or bad, family members. I guess family members could be good or bad too, but when we have a real emotional connection with someone, it's the same as when we read a character. And that was a very enlightening thing for me to realize. And it kind of explains why Harry Potter, for instance, Ron and Hermione and the whole crew from Hogwarts, and James Bond and other characters like my Lincoln Rhyme character from the Bone Collector series, people love him. And it's that there is actually apparently a physiologic response to that. It was a long way of explaining that. When I wrote The Never Game, I thought I wanted to do more with Coulter. It certainly is a plot-driven book, but I wanted to give him, really a very layered background, and very quickly I'll explain what it is. His father was a brilliant professor at an unnamed university in San Francisco Bay. It's really Berkeley, but I don't mention that. And he was kind of a quirky fellow, amateur historian. He loved the American West. He was a scientist as well, and believe it or not, people do this. They do physics for a hobby, and that was one of his hobbies. He taught political science as well, and he made a discovery. Now, I don't at all talk about what that discovery is, but we learn fairly early in the book that this is in the Never Game now, that whatever that discovery is, it lit some fuses among some people who appear pretty reprehensible, and they started to come after him. And he picked up the family, his wife and 3 children, and moved to a compound in the Sierra Nevada mountains and learned survivalism, and taught that to the children, never explaining really who was after them and why. And there was apparently within the family and among his colleagues this concept that he's a paranoid schizophrenic, and he certainly did have some issues along those lines. But he nonetheless, he said, well, you kids are going to have to protect yourself. You're going to have to learn to defend yourself. So Coulter Shaw, was raised as a survivalist, not a wacko, the alt-right the end is coming kind of survivalist. I did some research on that, and there's a whole panoply of people who simply want to drop out. Some don't really care for the government. Some don't trust the government. Some believes the aliens from planet Xantar will be coming down at any minute. But he simply, there was no politics involved. It was simply, I want to protect myself and protect my family when the bad thing comes. And we don't learn about the bad thing in this book, but I'm working on the sequel right now, and we get a few more hints about the bad thing.
You know, I don't generally meet a lot of survivalists living in New York, but I met this guy one time. He was a photographer, and he had done a story on survivalists, I think out in Utah or something. And he said he was talking, it was this couple, they had just gotten married, and they'd gone to a shooting range for their wedding reception. And he said that the wife said that she always carried 4 guns at any given time. And he said, well, why do you need 4 guns? And she said, well, if somebody grabs me like this, then I can reach this gun and shoot him like this. And if somebody grabs me like this, I can reach this gun and shoot him like this. And that's always stuck in my mind. I don't know if you encountered any sort of characters like that in your research.
No, I will tell you, talking about technique again, when I was a much younger writer, I was filled with the concept that one had to experience the same thing the character did in your book. And I lived in Manhattan for a long time. That's where I was living when I wrote my first books. And I bugged the New York City police, who are very, very gracious and generous with their time. But I'd say, I've got to get into your radio dispatch center. I've got to listen to the radio calls as they come in and see what buttons they push. And then I did a book that featured the bomb squad out of the 6th Precinct, which if any of your listeners know New York, that's in the Greenwich Village, the West Village. And so they said, oh, sure, come on in. So I walk in, and it was the appointed time, and then I walk in. These 2 guys are staring down at a thing that looks like a stick of dynamite, and one of them says, "Oh God!" and he stands up and pitches it to me. And of course, you know, they knew the green writer was in, and I had a fun time with them. Petted the dogs, the bomb sniffing dogs, and so forth, and took voluminous notes, probably a tenth of which I used. I found that when you actually talk to people, you tend to get, so enamored of their story that it skews you away from yours. And so, no, I didn't talk to any survivalists. Most of the research I do is online. And then I do have a rather vivid imagination, so I can kind of sit back and picture what it would be like. And so I didn't, although I had a lot of fun creating the Coulter Shaw's father's survivalist mode. He would sit around, no computer, of course, absolutely. We all know the dangers of computer, given your podcast, of course, the misuse and so forth, and the spine and things like that. But he would read to the children, and the favorite book, he made them actually memorize Self-Reliance by Ralph Waldo Emerson. And that was kind of his kinder, gentler form of survivalism, although he also taught the children to fight, to shoot, to make weapons. Graduation was climbing a 100-foot cliff in the dark, not solo free climbing, but where you have no ropes, but you're roped in, but you cannot use ropes. Free climbing, you can't use ropes to assist your ascent, but it's a safety thing. So you're not gonna, if you fall, you're not gonna hurt yourself too badly. Yeah,
but so you didn't feel any pressure to do that as part of your research?
No, absolutely not. My excuse was, well, I'm really busy, and I actually am quite busy. I write at least a book a year on 4 or 5 short stories, and then I'm on tour. I spend about 2 months out of the year touring. So my excuse was I'm too busy. But the fact is, probably a better author than I would have gone out west somewhere and gotten nice and buff, and then insisted that he or she be dropped with, I don't know, a container of crackers and 1 safety pin, and have to make their way back to civilization.
Yeah. Well, so you mentioned the misuse of computers, and one reason I wanted to talk to you about this book in particular is because it involves Silicon Valley, which is really relevant for this podcast. So sort of what gave you the idea that you wanted to write a book set in Silicon Valley?
Sure. This is the 4th of what I call my high-tech quartet. of books. Going back to 1999, I wrote a book called The Blue Nowhere, also set in Silicon Valley, about a psychotic computer hacker who used a modem. And now when I talk about the book, it's still rather popular. It kind of gets into the mystique of those early days, the 1990s in Silicon Valley, and people are still interested. But I'll say that he hacked in via a modem, and the kids just have no idea what that is.
It's like almost as scary as a serial killer, the idea of using a modem.
I know, right? Yeah. And it was quite humbling, actually. And then occasionally I'll get somebody who, and I'm not going to do it, but I'll get somebody who was in the industry, or at least remembers the 2400 baud, and he can make that noise, the dial-up noise, the kind of crackling noise. So anyway, that was the first one, the Blue Nowhere. The second was a book called The Broken Window, which was about data mining. And a serial killer actually worked for a data mining company. And of course, as you, I'm sure know, and I'm sure it's been on your podcast, the absolute ubiquity of data mining operations. The government is really a small portion of it. It's mostly commercial data miners, but they share that with the government, of course, and that was a kind of a frightening thing. And I had in that book, The Broken Window, I had this character who was a serial killer, but sometimes for the fun of it, he would simply steal someone's identity and destroy their life. And that would be his project for 6 months. And some ended up committing suicide. Some ended up bankrupt, their families falling apart. The third was a book called Roadside Crosses, in which there is a podcaster, actually, a blogger, I should say, and he uses his blog as a platform to disseminate fake news. But he does it tactically. He does it in a way to destroy people's lives, and also as a cover-up for the other crimes that he perpetrates. So he kind of shifts the blame. And finally, we come to number 4, which is The Never Game, and that is about video games. And if I can tell you where the specific idea came from very quickly, I was visiting my family in Austin, and my I think at the time 8-year-old niece said, Uncle Jeff, can we play video games? And I said, well, honey, I played a little bit, but I really don't know much about him. And she said, that's okay, I'll show you. And instantly she took my cell phone, got my passcode, and downloaded a game. And I think it was Minecraft. I'm pretty sure that's what it was. But we did the online version, so we both connected to Wi-Fi, and I'm looking at it, and I see that kind of odd landscape, and I could see her avatar, and she could see mine. And I said, honey, well, what do I do now? And she said, you die. And she pulled out a sword, and just stabbed me or cut my head off or something. And I was a little cross because I didn't know the rules of the game. I didn't. I'd heard that. Oh, I heard that Minecraft was a kind of they're called like the social games where you build things, and you have to. I know this. You should be in your house after dark for some reason, but you raise things and build stuff. Then there's also the survival mode, and that's what we were playing. And then she explained it to me, and we had a lot of fun playing. But in the back of my mind, I thought, well, what if somebody were to take a video game and bring it out of the computer, out of the digital world, and reenact it in real life, and that the people who were trying to solve the crime and rescue the victims, because in my book you need recurring victims, they had to get a feel for the video game. They had to work with somebody who knew the video game, and or else be a gamer themselves. And that's basically where the idea came from. I made up a game, the Whispering Man action adventure game, survival action adventure game, because I imagine most of your listeners are familiar with the different categories of games. And so it was apparently the bad guy became so obsessed with this game he started to reenact it in real life, and my hero, Coulter Shaw, gets involved in the case, and he has to learn a bit about the game and try to stop the fellow before he strikes again.
So was this game that you dreamed up, The Whispering Man, was that modeled on any particular games, or was that purely out of your own imagination?
No, that was my imagination. I have to say I worked backwards. I needed a game. That was the concept. I knew I wanted to have the game, kind of a popular Blizzard Entertainment game, or id, one of the the big companies. I made up a company too. It's not one of the real companies, but a big kind of game that was a little glitzy and people would enjoy playing it. But then I needed it to fit certain requirements, such as a victim would be secreted in an abandoned location. I wanted it to be the graphics to be good, but I didn't want it to be a shooter game. I wanted it to be more of the action adventure, try to figure out the clues. I wanted it to be a Morpeg. I wanted other people to play. And I like the idea, this just occurred to me, I like the idea of the person being abandoned with 5 objects. And they had to use those objects either as weapons or as possibly for barter to trade with another player, or possibly as a way to signal for escape. And that gave me a chance to, create a world where the victim in real life was given these objects too, which is in fact a clue that leads Coulter to realize that it's based on a game. And so that I constructed the game that way. And I've been on tour now, and a couple people have asked me if it's a real game, and they say, "Oh, that sounds like something I'd like to play." So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, since you mentioned that you spent 8 months doing research, and, I assume that, you did a lot of, well, you actually mentioned that you read a lot of books about video games as research for this, but I could see the danger of 8 months of research into video games turning into just 8 months of playing video games if you're not careful.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I really didn't know much, and I know much about them, and I've played off and on over the years. I was a Pong guy. I was in law school, and my girlfriend at the time bought me I guess it was maybe the first, really home video game. It was sort of even pre-console back in I guess that'd be back in the 70s. And, I have to say, you could only watch the ball bouncing back and forth for so long, but it was kind of fun. And then one thing I was more interested in was the text-based games. Adventure was really the first big one, and that is where I don't know if you're familiar with them or not, but it's all okay. Yeah, well, of course you know. They're for your listeners. So you interact with the computer by writing things, and it will respond. And it could be the cave. I can't think of the colossal. Was it the colossal?
Yeah, Colossal Cave Adventure. Yeah,
that's it. That became a slightly more sophisticated version, and there were only certain. The algorithms were very simple back then, and there were only certain comments or certain things that you could type in that it would recognize. So, for instance, you would need an axe, and the cave would say there's an axe in front of you, and you think, well, I need an axe. And so you type pick up axe, and you got a question mark, or nothing happened. And it was bend it down and pick up axe, and that's what worked. And I remember that. And then I played Flight Simulator, and then it didn't really play too much until more recently with a stepson and my nieces, and we've done Mario, some platform games. I tried Halo. I did a Kinect, the Xbox Kinect, which is it's kind of like Wii, where you don't actually have a controller, but you stand in front of a box that sees you, and you can ski, you can play tennis, and you can box, and that was kind of fun. One game that I was quite interested in, it's not so much something you play, but you experience. It's called No Man's Sky. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, it's the sort of galaxy exploration game.
Yeah. And it is, I read about it in the New Yorker a few years ago, and, you would know far more about this than I would. I'm sure your listeners do too. But there was some type of an algorithm software that created the universe you went to on the fly, and I wish I had the numbers in front of me, but it's something like there were 14 million possibilities of planets that did not exist until you went to that segment of the universe, and then there were probably universes upon universes, and I found that just fascinating. But in general, I've had sort of a I guess I'd say lukewarm relationship with games. I remember my sister gave me a crime game a few years ago because I write criminal novels, and you were a detective, and you had to get up in the morning, get in your car, and go solve the crime. And so you wake up in the morning, and you've got to. I walk out to the car. Where are the keys? I'd have to walk back in the house and get the keys. Oh, I should lock the door. Put your security system on. And I didn't even get to the part where I could shoot the bad guy. I was just trying to get to the office and interrogate somebody. So I have to say I got a little bored with them. But in general, I've had fun looking at them for the book. But I have to say I'm not much of a gamer.
So you mentioned the text-based adventure game. I actually have a funny story about that because my parents both worked for IBM, and this is even before personal computers. I was a baby, and they had brought me to the lab, and you could only play the game on a terminal, because it was on a mainframe, so you had to leave your office. So they had kind of left me in their office and had gone to play adventure, and I started crying, and they didn't hear me, and one of the security people came around and just found this unattended baby and was like, and found my parents and was like, your baby's crying and they're just sitting there playing video games,
There's probably an offense if they were in New York, they were probably in New York, they were IBM, in the state penal code for computer child neglect or something along those lines.
Yeah. Well, but I mean, video games, they do have a way of just sucking you in, and a lot of people have kind of negative feelings about video games, particularly when I was growing up in the 90s. There was a lot of negative feelings about gamers, and you reference that a little bit in the book. There's a character, Anthony Prescott, and he says, "You ask me, I think anyone who plays video games is a bit off." Is that is that an attitude you think is still pretty prevalent?
I would think not. I mean, certainly to some extent. I'm sure there's a portion of the swath of the country where that's looked down upon. I've actually heard, and I can't cite it specifically, but something I'd read that some people in I guess I'll say the Bible Belt, felt that games are the devil's handiwork. And if you look at some of the games, of course, there's a great deal of violence. Grand Theft Auto, for instance, where the goal is to murder police and murder people. There's more to it than that, but you certainly get points for doing that. And I think there's gamers could be a pariah in certain circles, but I found in my research that I was astonished at how big the industry was. It's bigger than Hollywood. It has, I think, at any given moment, 120 million people in the United States playing some form of a game. I should say during any given day, at some point, play a video game, and it might be just a handheld Candy Crush or Angry Birds. Or it could be someone who's been playing, Doom nonstop, or Fortnite nonstop for 3 or 4 hours. I had also thought that it was mostly young people playing, and probably it is, but a sizable number of people over 50 play. I mean, like millions, tens of millions play somewhat regularly. So I don't think there's really too much of a dark side that people are looking at. I did find that the big concern, I think, is the health issue, that they do have the addictive quality. And one of the epigrams in the book is a quotation from the World Health Organization that says basically it can be addictive behavior. And, it's an addiction like anything else. So, liquor can be, certain medications can be harmful. Any kind of behavior can be harmful in excess, but with the video games, I was a little surprised that the WHO had chimed in on this, but apparently they feel it can be a bit of a concern if it interferes with normal functioning of life.
I mean, one of the characters in the book mentions this article from American Scientist called "Can Video Games Be Good for You?" I assume that's a real article. Mm-hmm. I didn't look that up. But...
It is. Yeah, it is. It's actually Scientific America, and only because I didn't want to go to the trouble to get permission. I don't quote it. Actually, if there's a quote in there, it's something I made up, a paraphrase. But that is one thing I found quite interesting, that games can produce some benefits. The science may be out on some of the issues, but for autism, for dyslexia, they keep an aging mind agile. I don't know that this made it into the book, but I heard too that there's an analgesic effect, and I'm not a doctor, but there's something about video games that if you concentrate on them enough, and games are they really do draw your attention. You don't want that creature from doom to get you, and you want to be sure you survive to do the Fortnite dance. And so you're so concentrating on these that you kind of forget your pain. I'd like to see more studies on that. And I also found that oddly enough, sitting in a dark room by yourself, you'd think really would be harmful to social interaction, but there are some people who feel that it has brought people who are otherwise extremely introverted, have a lot of trouble connecting, brought them out into society, and that carries over into the real world, even if you're playing an online role-playing game as antagonists. Nonetheless, you also occasionally play with someone on your team, and that it's made people more social. So and then, I have to say, too, that who doesn't like to waste time? Myself, my favorite is watching YouTube. Baby goats in pajamas are always fun. And that kind of, it's a stress reliever. They take stress away. And whereas you have to concentrate on the game, of course, I don't know, I find it, when I was playing, kind of a pleasant concentration. It's very exciting. You get very involved in the game. And I came away with kind of a cathartic experience, even though I almost uniformly was slaughtered at some point by people who've played far more than I. And, realistically, who's the avatar? You don't know. It's probably like an 8-year-old kid in Germany or someone who saw this avatar lumbering around, not knowing what he was doing, and bang, I was dispatched.
Well, so one of the characters in the book is Maddie Poole, who's sort of a Twitch streamer. You want to talk about that character?
Yeah, that actually, again, was inspired by an article in the New Yorker, and I can't remember the particular fellow who was profiled, but I didn't know about Twitch at that point, and there are other sites. And just for you listeners who aren't familiar, that's a site where you watch people play games, and you can watch your favorite gamers. The gamers have the software allows you to see their screen, but you also see them on camera, and they usually have a ongoing commentary about in Call of Duty why they're running over here to shoot this fellow, or why they're using this weapon, or what they're going to do now. And I had no idea that world existed, and then I learned that these people have agents. They can make millions of dollars a year. They are sponsored by things like, I assume, like Red Bull or caffeine drinks and so forth. And Maddie is someone who does this for a living, and she has a bit of ethics about it, that she doesn't want to become too glitzy. For her, the world exists between her and whatever game she's playing, and she plays a lot. She's particularly enamored of Doom, which was really one of the first shooter games going back a long time. And we begin to wonder why she is so obsessed with the plane, and why some of her behavior seems a little curious. Well, Coulter falls in with her and uses her as I guess we'd say an expert, to walk him through the video gaming world and give him some idea of what this fellow who created who's playing the Whispering Man in real life, what he might be up to, and maybe some ways in which to entrap him. But for a while, Maddie remains a bit of a mystery character, and I don't want to give anything away, but there is a bit of a revelation, and it could be good, it could be bad in terms of the story. But she is representative of people who really exist and who can make millions of dollars, if not actually on Twitch, but on the contests that are held at like the C3 and I made up C3. It's E3 is the real exposition, but there are many gaming expositions around the world actually. And while I was researching it, I think a team from Japan won $5 million and I can't remember what game they were playing, and playing in an auditorium of, it had to be tens of thousands of people.
Yeah, no, it's huge. Well, so with these, you mentioned that you read all these books for research. You mentioned books like Console Wars and Blood, Sweat, and Pixels. I was just curious, how did you find those books? Was it someone recommending those to you, or were you just kind of like clicking around on Amazon, or how did you find all those books on video games?
No, mostly Amazon. Again, I do most of my research on my own. I didn't talk to any experts in the field. I do have a friend who was in national security, and he was telling me about he found that games kind of helped him in his work. I mean, he didn't fly drones or anything like that, but he liked the way that gamers were, I guess they say, kind of more on the cutting edge, because when they're beholden to their imagination, and of course, the consumers too, they'd come up with very clever algorithms and clever concepts. So he said he enjoyed playing, and it to some extent helped him in his work. And he recommended, I think it was, oh man, I don't have the book in front of me now, but one that dealt with the history of gaming, going back to the. I didn't realize that video games have been around since the 1950s. Of course, played then on mainframes. I think there maybe were some smaller. Of course, no personal computers back then, but maybe it wasn't ENIAC or some of these huge machines, but some significant sized computer. And the book spent a lot of time about that, and how the games were created mostly within the computer labs to try to show off the skills of the designers, software coders, and so forth, and see what they could actually do.
Yeah. You mentioned Doom. If you haven't read it, there's a book called Masters of Doom by David Kushner, which is absolutely amazing. It's such a good book about video games.
All right. Yeah, because I'm a bit hooked now on the subject, and I may very well I'm doing a sequel to the Never game now, but not set in Silicon Valley. Sequel in the sense that at the end of the Never game, there's sort of a springboard to another reward that Colter Shaw may be pursuing, and but I'm making a little Colter Shaw universe, so that there will be, I almost gave something away here, but there will be characters in the Never game who appear in future books. And now that he has a sense of the what the gaming world is like in Silicon Valley, and the fact that he was born near the Valley, he was born in San Francisco, or up near Berkeley. He'll be going back there. So I'll look that up. It's called Masters of Doom. Was that
Masters of Doom? Yeah, and also Blake J. Harris, who wrote Console Wars, he has a new book out. I just interviewed him about it, called The History of the Future. And if you're interested in conspiracies in Silicon Valley, that's an amazing real life one. So you should definitely check that out.
I'll look that up. Well, now, did he happen to mention? I heard that, if I remember correctly, that Seth Rogen was thinking of doing a movie about Console Wars, and maybe one of these Elizabeth Holmes kind of biopic, factual, but done up for Hollywood. Did he say anything about that? Is that in the works?
Yeah, so they're doing both a documentary, and it was a feature film, but it's now a TV series. I think,
it is really. Oh.
Yeah, and that's in development. But I think he said there's it's moving along now. I think they had a pilot script that was finished. But yeah, hopefully that'll be out soon, because I'm really looking forward to that.
Look forward to reading that, or seeing that, I should say. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you're at the same point where you're listing all these books that you read, you also mentioned that your earlier novel, you mentioned Roadside Crosses. You say that also involves video games. So I was just curious what it was like writing about video games in 2009 versus 2019.
It played a minor part of the book. That was the one about primarily about the blogger who was creating fake news for his own nefarious uses. But one of the subplots in the book was about a young man who was bullied, and he, as often happens, it's when you're online, it's very easy to diss someone and say horrible things about him. And then it turned out that there was somebody who was bullying him might have had something to do with the main case. and yet, through proxies and Tor and which were in existence then, it's very hard to trace back to see who's actually playing the game. And there were ways to either play without a credit card or log on or even hack in. It's not uncommon for players to do that. So the police couldn't find who this person was tormenting the kid, and if they could, the avatar or whoever was playing the avatar might very well have a connection to the overall murders that were going on. So what happens? But my detective hero, Catherine Dance, who's a kinesics expert, and kinesics is a body language in effect, sits down with the young man and uses body language analysis to see what she can learn about the avatar. Admittedly, it was a bit far-fetched, but what she learned was, it was some years ago now, but I guess she would see what kind of weapon he or she used, maybe whether they were left-handed or right-handed, and then combined with some knowledge of the game. I think it was like it may have been World of Warcraft actually, which is of course a massive online role-playing game at that time. Whenever that was written, probably 10 years ago, there were easily 100,000 people playing it at one time, and but she managed through her own analysis of the avatar's actions and through what the bullied boy knew to narrow down maybe a geographic locale, and in some way, it helped solve the crime. It didn't really. I have to say it didn't really. It would have been too miraculous if she said, "Oh, it's Fred Jones." Of course, I should have seen that, but it did help. So I had some fun with that. But I'll tell you about the research for that, because at that point I knew nothing about video games. It had been Adventure, Pong, and maybe Pac-Man and Ms. Pac-Man. But I I hired the daughter of a very good friends of mine, and she was going to Duke University. She's a freshman, I guess, and she was quite the gamer. And I said, "Can you walk me through some of the games?" So we joined World of Warcraft, and she gave me tips and played. And then I said, "Okay, it's very helpful." Now, one thing that you could really help me with too is the language, because the kids in this story, the kid who's bullied, is in middle school, I guess early high school, maybe who's like 15, I think, 14 or 15. And I said, I want the language to be authentic, not computer language. I mean, I want what the kids say nowadays. And she said, "Oh, I don't know that. That was 4 years ago. But
yeah.
You can hire my younger sister who was 14." And so I did, and she gave me the lingo of the 14-year-old. She was not really much of a gamer, but I thought that was so funny. We had to outsource the research to a middle schooler.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting that you were writing about this sort of fake news, people smearing each other on social media kind of stuff in 2009. I mean, I know it was going on then, but it just seems like it's gotten 100 times worse since then.
It's just shocking. I mean, I went to journalism school, University of Missouri. I worked as a reporter for some years, and we would not think of reporting any story, publishing anything. I did print journalism, magazines mostly. We would not think of publishing anything unless we had multiple sources of attribution. We researched for weeks, sometimes months before we published the story. We stood by everything. It was completely accurate. And now this concept of on the one hand, just the cavalier attitude about news. I say it, so it must be true. And then the weaponizing of information, and that was true in my book. But now we see it on a daily basis, and it's intended to destroy careers, both in politics and among business people. I just find it troubling, extremely troubling.
Yeah, and not just the I say it, therefore it's true, but the so-and-so said it, and now I'm going to pass it along without checking whether it's true or not, even if I'm a journalist. I mean, I just find that so distressing.
The game of telephone, remember that? You whisper something to someone, and I do hear quite a bit, and I'm giving away my leanings here, but I'm very troubled to hear about this evil media. You know, the liberal media. Often that adjective is not used because capital M media is kind of a trope. You know, it's a key word for maybe NPR, the New York Times, or the Wall Street Journal, a little less the Wall Street Journal, but the Washington Post certainly. And you know, media is the First Amendment, folks. This is what keeps us free. This is what makes sure that we have a democracy that we can be proud of and that protects us. And I see a lot of erosion. Sadly, a lot of erosion.
Yeah. I mean, do you think there's anything to do about that, or like what would you want to say to people to improve the situation?
Well, for one thing, I found it really doesn't help to say things to people. There's so much entrenched attitude now that I find quite troubling. I really don't talk politics with my friends. Those who feel the opposite of my way, they're still good friends. I still enjoy their company, but it just serves no purpose. I'm not going to change their minds, and they're not going to change my mind. What I say to people is, well, you know, that's an interesting point if it comes up. I might want to look at this, and I occasionally will cite an article or cite something that I feel is a fairly accurate representation of the truth, and maybe they'll look at it. I do feel in the huge view, the overview. We are the greatest country on earth. We have systems in place. We do have the First Amendment, so that the people who do say things that are untrue, there's a mechanism for that to be brought to light. So I'm not necessarily pessimistic, but I have to say it's a lot different from when I was studying journalism in the 1960s and 70s, and we had, of course, fewer outlets. We had the nightly news, Huntley and Brinkley, Walter Cronkite, of course. It was so ironic back then. Your listeners, many of them know this, but we had basically an hour and a half of news a day. There would be the 6 o'clock national news. I think there was local news. I grew up in Chicago, probably WGN from probably 5 to 6, and that included some soft human interest kind of things. And then I think there was 11 o'clock news, and I can't get my times just right, but that was probably just before Johnny Carson. And we survived pretty well with that, and we got many more newspapers, of course, but just in terms of broadcast, now of course it's every person for himself, 24/7.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's move on from that depressing subject to another depressing subject, which I didn't even know about this so much, but I mean, obviously I knew about the skyrocketing cost of living in Silicon Valley, but in the novel, you say that there are these kind of like tent cities in parking lots where people, even though they have good jobs in tech or something, but they can't even afford to live close enough to work, so they have to like live in these sort of temporary tents, basically.
Yeah. The article I read, I did not witness any of that myself, but the article I read, not so much tents, but they just live out of their car. I mean, maybe they would have something, a little camping thing connected to their car, but there's that issue. There's the issue of people who do want to commute, having to commute 3 hours or so. My sister lives in Monterey, which is on a good day, probably a little over 2 hours drive. There are people moving there to commute to Silicon Valley, and of course that would be during rush hour. So they've got 3 hours each way, and of course there has to be a subplot in the Never Game about, and I'm not going to give anything away here, but is perhaps real estate behind what's going on. And when we authors who write murder mysteries and thrillers create villains, you really don't have to sketch out the bad guy very in much detail. All you have to do is say they run a bank, they own a drug company, or they're in real estate, and right away that's the Snidely Whiplash image comes to mind. And as far as how that's going to be fixed, I just don't. I have no clue. Maybe real estate. We don't want our, real estate bubble to pop. And I think there it's pretty endemic. I don't think I don't really think it's a bubble suggests a false excess valuation. I don't think that's the case. I think it's market supply and demand.
Well, so one of these game developers in the novel is planning to build a development called Siliconville. What do you think about that idea?
That was an idea, and I'll just mention it briefly. It's a consortium of game developers and producers and studios, and some other Silicon Valley people, coders, and I think I may have a venture capital person involved in that or not. That really wants to, on the one hand, wants to help people out, people who live there, and create low-cost housing. And on the other hand, the consortium that's done this has a rather clever idea, because they don't want to see the migration of the brain trust from Silicon Valley. And there's quite a bit of that. I was in Denver on book tour just the other day, and the fellow who's driving me to the event pointed out that this is our new high-tech area. He said, this is our Silicon Valley. I don't remember what part of Denver it was. I think it was near Highlands Ranch, south of Denver. And he said, that's going to be Colorado's Silicon Valley. And in my research, I learned that that's true. There's certainly in Scotland, there's Silicon Glen, which I think is Glasgow. And, everybody has the tech area. But there are people who just, they can't afford to live there. They simply can't do it. And, the cost of living in Silicon Valley has always been high, San Francisco Bay Area. In fact, I just heard something on, wait, don't tell me, that great NPR funny quiz show, where in San Francisco, office space is so expensive, people are taking a parking space, putting a table and chairs, and of course everybody's got a Wi-Fi modem now, and they've got their computer and telephone, and that is their office. As long as they keep feeding money into the meter, there's apparently nothing one can do to kick them out. I don't think the law, at least as of a couple of weeks ago when I was listening to the program, the law doesn't say thou shalt park a car there, simply thou shalt feed the meter. I suspect the city council may be addressing this issue, but that does give you an idea of the really insane rents of the area.
Well, then people can just get a van with their desk inside. I mean, that's what Jason Blum, I don't know if you know him, he's the horror film producer, but he has like a van with a desk in it, and he just drives around to meetings and stuff and works out of his van.
Oh, that's a great idea.
Yeah. So you mentioned that actually video games are more profitable than Hollywood right now, and I feel like there are so many crime and thriller stories set in and around the film industry, and I don't know of too many crime and thriller stories set around the video game industry. Are there ones that you should know of that I'm missing?
I didn't find any, and it's one of the reasons I picked that topic. And I go to Amazon's a source for so much stuff, and I kind of typed in those search engine words and didn't see anything. Occasionally there'll be a murder mystery that involves, it might involve data mining or hacking, but nothing in Silicon Valley that I could find. And I like to be on the cutting edge of that. And one of the things that I found quite interesting was the segments of the market that are growing, exponentially growing, and that is not the consoles or the computers. That seems to be pretty steady. It's not eroding. It's not a zero-sum game. Those are still pretty steady, with most people, I think, the slight majority playing on computers. But then there's always the PlayStation and Xbox and the Switch. I think that's the new Nintendo system. But the handheld games, the smartphone games, it's just and I don't have the figures in front of me, but it's just taken off like gangbusters. And when I'm we people who write books, we do it because we do feel that a novel is probably the richest experience of storytelling. I like it because the readers are kind of partners with us. So I may write a passage and I put some adjectives in and describe something, and fairly accurately describe the character and what his or her voice sounds like. But then the reader takes it from there, and that makes the story part of their mind. So I'm always on the lookout for, are people still reading? And if so, what are they reading? And what are my main forms of competition? So whenever I'm on a plane, which I am quite a bit on book tour and for research, I always walk to the back to use the restroom back there. And then I walk forward slowly and see what people are doing. And I think there are a lot of readers, often on the digital form, their Kindles or the iBook platforms, but they're playing a lot of games, and it's not on the computers; it's on their phones. And some of them are what I think I heard the phrase "time wasters" like Candy Crush, and I hope I haven't insulted everybody out there, but who doesn't like to waste times? I mentioned YouTube videos of baby goats in pajamas. I like to waste time too, but I see a lot of those, and some that actually are rather sophisticated. And then we had Tetris from years ago, which I think may have been the most popular video game ever. The statistics seem a little they go back and forth a bit, but Tetris was kind of moving blocks in a line, or it was not a action adventure game or a shooter game. You just had to move an object from one point to another and try to beat the system.
Right. All right. So before we run out of time, you mentioned reading The Difference Engine by William Gibson and Bruce Sterling, and I was just curious if you could talk about how much interest do you have in science fiction, and how much science fiction have you read?
I read a lot of science fiction when I was younger. Ray Bradbury was one of my all-time favorite writers. And I have to say, one of the things I liked most about his science fiction was that it kind of emphasized the fiction more than the science part. Certainly there were space people, there were alien creatures, there were things that we would now look at as, the 1950s, early aspects of computers. But they were really human interest stories that could have been taken out of the science context. I read Isaac Asimov, Stranger in a Strange Land. I loved Arthur C. Clarke, and I would recommend to your listeners who have not read it. It's a very, very short piece. Arthur C. Clarke's The Sentinel, which was the story that inspired 2001. And it's entirely different. You would not recognize it. You largely wouldn't recognize it. There's a monolith involved, but it's just a stunning and a harrowing piece of short fiction. But I read some of Philip K. Dick, of course, which was largely futuristic writing. I thought about maybe going that route, but I like crime writing better, because my goal is to write the most emotionally engaging story I possibly can. I want readers to open the book to page 1 and just not stop. And part of doing that is to create in readers' minds a realistic threat, a credible threat. And writers like J.K. Rowling, we all know Hogwarts isn't real, but nonetheless, she is so masterful. She can bring off that sense that I am so worried that something's going to happen to Harry or Hermione or Ron that we keep ripping through those pages. Stephen King creates horror worlds that are not real, but nonetheless he can keep the pot boiling. I'm a little more comfortable in writing about credible threats, like the fellow sitting next to you on the bus, maybe doing something kind of weird with his fingers. He's sending a signal to something. What on earth is he doing there? Clearly he's a bit insane. And so you start to say, I saw somebody on the bus who was doing something like that. Now I feel kind of nervous. So I want to bring the tension home to the readers in a way that I think that at least I would not feel comfortable trying to do with science fiction or fantasy or horror. But I would recommend The Difference Engine, which is a wonderful book. I mean, anything that William Gibson does is great. I believe he created a book a few years ago, not inexpensive book, that destroyed itself. You'd have to fact check it, but I was fascinated with it. It was a science fiction book. I think it was printed on something that, when exposed to the air, disappeared. So you basically had maybe a week to read it. And I just thought, what a clever idea.
Yeah, I sort of vaguely remember that, but I couldn't tell you the details either. But I think it's interesting with books like The Never Game sort of shows that there's kind of a blurring between science fiction and crime fiction as the technology, continues to advance, that these things that would have been science fiction 30 years ago are now just crime fiction,
Well, I look at the fact is I'm talking to you on a cell phone that is smarter than ENIAC from, one of the first computers from 60 years ago. And, tomorrow I'll open up my computer to the tech page of the Times, and there'll be, some new thing. They'll be implanting phones in us and our brains pretty soon, I suspect.
I mean, are there any other books or stories of yours that you think would particularly appeal to Geek's Guide to the Galaxy listeners?
Well, Dave, it's very funny. I wrote The Blue Nowhere. That was 20 years ago. And I thought, okay, that's good. That's my tech book. And it has some really good twists and turns in it. And if anybody is interested in the early days of Silicon Valley, the Palo Alto Research Center days, the Hewlett Packard, of course, Woz and Steve Jobs, the band, all the folks creating the computer technology in their garages and so forth. It's a good book for them to read. Okay, it's all over with. Last tech book I'm writing, on to other stuff. Murders, kidnappings, serial crimes, wonderful. Then along comes this idea of blogging. And I thought, blogging, that's kind of interesting. Now, is it technically technology? Well, in a way it is, because there really wasn't a platform for that until the personal computers came about and, smartphones, because presumably you could do a type of blog on shortwave radio maybe, or some kind of terrestrial station, but technology made that possible. And then, of course, the video games, the bullying became something. And then for that was my book, Roadside Crosses. And so, okay, I'll do 2 books. That'll be my duet. And then I became fascinated with data mining and the amount of information that the both commercial operations and the government has on us, for good and bad. And I'm pretty balanced in the book. There's some good stuff that comes out of data mining. Lives are saved, but then also lives are lost thanks to it. So that's it. Okay, the trilogy, perfect. Last time I'm writing a tech book. And then my niece killed me in Minecraft. And I said, okay, now it's going to be a quartet.
There's a book called The Steel Kiss I came across references to that sounded like it might have some sort of technology angle.
It does. It's more about product liability, but it's about smart products. So it does have a tech side to it. It's really more about manufacturing issues. I was a product liability lawyer some years ago, and I wanted to bring that into the fray. But yeah, it does. I mean, there's a scene there where the baby monitor hacking issues.
Yeah.
Because they're Wi-Fi enabled, and they're relatively easy to when there's a handshake between the smartphone and the server. It's possible, it's not easy, but it's possible to get into that. And there were people falling through stairs and renegade buzzsaws going off. But the scene that most readers seemed to be troubled them the most was a baby monitor hacking in which no child was hurt. In my books, I never hurt a child. I never hurt an animal. Those are my rules. But the mom and dad have left the child. No, they're not going to play adventure, but they leave the child in the crib with the baby monitor right there, and go off to try to woo a client. The father's a lawyer, and they're trying to woo the client into his firm. And leave the baby, but they've got the baby monitor right there. And what happens? But the bad guy hacks into the system, and he is now speaking to the baby from a remote location. He's nowhere near the child, but he's saying, "Oh, look, cute little Sally," because he's hacked into their system. He knows the name. "Oh, cute little Sally, don't you want to come live with me now?" And of course, the parents hear this, and they're absolutely mortified, and they run into the room and see that he's not there. It was just done basically as a practical joke because the father had insulted this fellow, not knowing who it was. And the people who had kids, of course, said that was the scare. I'm sorry the guy got caught in the tumbling elevator in the opening scene, but that was the scariest scene to them, and no one was actually injured.
All right, so unfortunately, we're pretty much out of time. Do you have any final thoughts, or just anything else you wanted to mention?
No. A really great conversation. Time flew by. I didn't even take a look at the clock, but really enjoyed it. And again, my compliments to you on a great podcast. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you so much. And yeah, I know you're on tour, so I'll let you go and get on with that. And I know you have a really busy schedule, but I just want to thank you again, Jeffery Deaver, so much for joining us. The new book is called The Never Game. So Jeff, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, Dave, thank you. You take care now.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Jeffery Deaver for joining us on the show. And remember that Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoyed the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.